Hello, I'm Jair Espinosa and this is Medal. Over the last decade and a half, authoritarian regimes have been on the rise around the world, including in countries like Brazil, Turkey, India, Hungary, Russia, China, and recently even in the US and Philippines. The rule of law, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press have been facing attacks from these governments. In this country, with another Marcos back in power, there are concerns he will continue the trend towards authoritarianism, like his father, and which his predecessor began. 31 million people voted for Marcos for president. Meanwhile, the new Department of Education Secretary, Vice President Sara Duterte, has pushed for the reinstatement of mandatory ROTC to instill nationalism and discipline in the youth. I believe this is the wrong approach to preserving democracy. So let's talk about education and democracy. Maraming mahalagang papel na ginagampanan ang edukasyon sa lipunan. Ngunit madalas nating makalimutan ang papel ng edukasyon sa pangangalaga ng ating demokrasya. Ayon sa dakilang pilosopo ng edukasyon na si John Dewey, democracy must be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. Ibig sabihin, hindi natural sa mga tao ang demokratikong pamumuhay at dapat itong ituro sa bawat henerasyon na daraan para hindi ito mamatay. Pag sinabi ng gobyernong otoritarian ang disiplina at nasyonalismo patungkol sa edukasyon, madalas ang ibig nilang sabihin ay pananahimik at pagpapasakop. Karaniwan, ang pananaw ng gobyerno sa edukasyon ay isang paraan ng pagkontrol sa taong bayan. Binibigyang diin sa mga tao na ang mabuting mamamayan ay siyang may walang pag-aalinlangang pagsuporta at katapatan sa mga pinuno ng bayan. At siyang may pagtanaw ng utang na loob sa mga mabubuting gawain ng pamahalaan. Ngunit, hindi ito ang tunay na ibig sabihin ng pagiging mamamayan sa isang demokrasya. Hindi tungkulin ng mamamayan na maging panatiko ng mga pinuno ng bayan. May mga panahon sa isang demokrasya na hindi dapat manahimik at magpasakop. Ano nga ba ang ibig sabihin ng pamumuhay sa isang demokrasya? Living in a democracy means, first and foremost, that the people participate in the decision-making for the country. Most significantly, the people elect leaders to represent them. Democracy means freedom to think for oneself and speak about one's beliefs. John Dewey argued that an uneducated public is a threat to democracy. For democracy to work, citizens must be able to participate in discourse and debate about policy, and this requires much knowledge. It requires that citizens stay informed and be able to tell good from bad information. People must be sufficiently knowledgeable about the law and their rights and duties. They must live responsibly so as not to disrupt the lives of others, valuing justice and equality. They must also be familiar with the functions of government, the systems of checks and balances, and be able to hold accountable those who abuse their power and position. So what does it mean to educate for democracy? Ang karamihan ng mga paaralan ay hindi demokratiko. Sa tradisyonal na paaralan, may ilang tao lang na may kapangyarihan na gumawa ng mga patakaran at mahalagang desisyon para sa lahat. Sa loob ng silid-aralan, nakadepende ang buong buhay ng mag-aaral sa kanyang guro. Mula sa kanyang gawain araw-araw, ano ang kailangan nilang aralin, maging sa kailan kakain, kailan magpapahinga, kailan pupunta sa banyo, at pati na ang mga gagawin nila pag-uwi sa bahay. Ang guro ang madalas na nasusunod at siya ring tanging pinagmumulan ng kaalaman at nagsasabi kung tama o mali ang ginagawa ng mga estudyante. Karaniwan, hindi nagsasalita ang mga estudyante kundi para sagutin ang mga tanong ng guro. Ayon sa edukador na si Deborah Meyer, hindi ito maganda para sa isang demokrasya.
It certainly was a model of an authoritarian regime in which the highest virtue was to comply. And its notion of respect was, which we should recognize today, that a lot of times respect is another word for fear. You're supposed to respect the authorities, which means you're supposed to be afraid of them. And I was shocked at that. And I thought, what an odd idea that we are raising children to be the citizens of a democracy by exposing them to 13 years of the most undemocratic institution that I had ever experienced. So how come we thought you could teach children what it meant to be in a democracy without experiencing a democracy?
Eksakto. Paano matututunan ng kabataan ang demokrasya kung hindi naman nila ito nararanasan? Ang karanasan ng mga mag-aaral sa paaralan na binibigyang diin ang otoridad at pagsunod ay hindi nakakatulong sa pagtuturo ng demokrasya. The educator John Taylor Gatto argued that the educational system was designed to produce mediocre intellects, to hamstring the inner life, to deny students appreciable leadership skills, and to ensure docile and incomplete citizens. So it could be that the seeming shortcomings of the education system are deliberate. Ngunit, meron ngayon lumalaganap na pagkikilos sa edukasyon, kung saan itinataob ang maladiktadoryang sistema sa loob ng paaralan. Ang tawag dito ay democratic schools. Sa mga democratic schools, ang mga estudyante, kahit mga bata, ay binibigyan ng karapatan mamili at magdesisyon sa kung anong gusto nilang gawin, anong gusto nilang matutunan, at kung kailan at paano nila gustong aralin ang mga bagay na pumukaw sa kanilang interes.
Lessons are totally not mandatory. The other basic word to describe our school is non-coercive, and I think that that is completely essential. We could not be the school we are now if students had to go to classes or if they had to learn a particular thing. There has to be a true free choice to be learning something or thinking about something else or out in the woods or playing in the creek or sitting and playing with a friend. There has to be a true choice all the time.
Yung filosofiya ng isang democratic school, umikot siya dun sa premise na yung mga bata ay mas maiging matututo kung sila yung namimili ng mga pwede nila matutunan. Nakaangkla to dun sa paniniwala namin na yung demokrasya ay hindi mo matututunan kung hindi mo siya na-experience.
The best time to learn read and write is the moment that you want to learn read and write. You have the motivation to do it and you have the ability to do it. But if you push someone that have no the ability to read and write, you're making the damage.
You aren't forced to do anything here. If you want to study biology and the next day you want to study how to build a wall, well, you can do so.
We help them to recognize what they want and to organize their time, but they can learn in different ways. They can learn by themselves, exploring books and games and other resources, and they can learn from other people. So we help them to find those people who might have this kind of interest that they are.
Taliwas ito dun sa traditional na modelo ng edukasyon kung saan yung eskwelahan mismo, yung curriculum or yung teacher ang nagde-decide kung ano yung matututunan ng mga bata. At very limited yung espasyo kung saan pwede magbigay ng suggestions yung mga bata sa mga gusto nila matutunan.
In democratic schools, students are not just passive recipients of information as in traditional schools, but they are actively engaged and involved in the construction of their own knowledge. Teachers serve as guides to students' learning rather than enforcers of a strict schedule and curriculum. These schools operate under the assumption that children who are trusted will become trustworthy, and that if you give them free rein over their learning, they will become responsible learners. There is a growing body of evidence that democratic schools are more effective than traditional schools at preparing young people for independent life and developing disciplined and responsible citizens of a democracy. The evidence shows that the way to instill discipline is more freedom, not more authority. Democracy is a way of life. It cannot be simply taught, it must be lived. Here are some other ways to help young people experience and learn democracy. 1. Let young people participate in policy making and decision making in the school and in the classroom. One important feature of democratic schools is the school meeting. Schools can help their students learn democracy by establishing democratic practice in making school rules, policies, and decisions. The school meeting involves all the students and teachers of the school, and students and teachers are treated as equals.
We decide the rules with everyone in the school circle, so you can, when you want something in the school, you can make a motion, you can write it down, and you are going to discuss it with the people who are interested, and you make a decision together.
We find it useful to discuss and agree on what the limits will be for individual behavior to guarantee the maximum freedom for everyone in the community and to keep people's activities from interfering with other people's activities. By meeting together and by discussing and by deciding what these frameworks will be, we're able to create an environment which allows maximum freedom for the maximum number of people.
Argument was the highest form of respect, that you took other people's ideas seriously, that you explored them, you tried them out to see if they would work. And when they didn't, you would try out something else.
If you find out, hey, I don't agree with this, you can always go to the school meeting and change it. That's the freedom you have, not that there are no rules. That's not the freedom.
So everyone has the possibility to say, I don't like it. Then you can ask, you have to ask other people for their arguments.
So when you only say, oh no, I don't want it because I think it's stupid, but that's not a valid argument. You have to have a good reason why you don't want it.
And it's interesting that when you look at the schools that do try to involve the young people in decision making, usually you can say these are better schools. More is learned, the behavior, the aggressive behavior of the children, violence is much less, and the number of days that children are away from school because of sickness or unhappiness, this is also much less. So we are beginning to gain evidence that as you make a school more democratic, it becomes a more successful school.
People who go to schools like Summerhill learn to be responsible for their actions. They learn to think about the welfare of the group rather than the individual. They learn to think about the rights and feelings of other people, so they learn compassion.
Ang mga school meeting ay nagbibigay ng kapangyarihan sa mga estudyante na gamitin ang kanilang mga boses para magpahayag ng kanilang mga pananaw at makisali sa paggawa ng mga desisyon. Ang bawat isa ay maaaring magsalita at ang alalahanin ng bawat isa ay pinapakinggan at sineseryoso. At hindi lang basta nasusunod ang nakararami, kundi naghahanap ang grupo ng solusyon sa problema na maaaring sang-ayunan ng lahat. Sa loob ng silid-aralan, maaaring pag-usapan ng buong klase ang mga patakaran na ipapatupad at ang mga gawain nila araw-araw. Sa ganitong proseso, natututo ang kabataan na gumawa ng argumento, timbangin at isaalang-alang ang iba't ibang pananaw, lutasin ang mga di pagkakasundo, at maghanap ng mga solusyon na mapagkakaisahan ng lahat. Natututunan din nila ang hustisya, katarungan, at pagkakapantay-pantay. 2. Educate students to value truth and reliable sources. Author Neil Postman argued that schools must train students to become expert crap detectors. He said, schools must serve as the principal medium for developing in youth the attitudes and skills of social, political, and cultural criticism. This means helping some people see that some part of their fondest beliefs or misconceptions, faulty assumptions, superstitions, and even outright lies. To become expert crap detectors, young people must have a healthy skepticism towards any claim, including those coming from their own tribe, which they may be predisposed to believe. We should not so readily accept things to be true until we have weighed the evidence. It is also important to know all the relevant facts. This is especially essential today when crap information has exploded online. Sa tradisyonal na paaralan, madalas subukin ang kakayahan ng mga estudyante na alalahanin ang tinurong impormasyon. Kaya nakadepende ang mga estudyante sa kanilang guro. Nagre-resulta ito sa mga diskusyon kung saan imbis na ibahagi ng mga estudyante ang kanilang mga ideya at saloobin, ay hinahanap na lang nila ang mga sagot na magpapasaya sa kanilang guro. Dahil nasa guro ang tanging kapangyarihan ng pamumuna at kritisismo, madalang ang pagkakataon ng kabataan na suriin ang sarili nilang mga ideya. Sa panahon ngayon, mahalagang matutunan ng kabataan kung paano aralin ang bagong impormasyon, kung paano mag-isip ng kritikal, paano ito suriin at kilatisin, paano pagsamahin sa ibang impormasyon, at paano timbangin ang bagong impormasyon ayon sa mga napatunayan ng katotohanan. Binalangkas ng edukador na si Deborah Meyer ang tinawag niyang 5 Habits of Mind na makakatulong sa pagkilatis ng bagong impormasyon. Evidence. Paano natin malalaman ang totoo sa hindi? Ano ang ebidensya? Pagkakatiwalaan ba ito? Nakakasiguro ba tayo dito? Viewpoint. Ano ang ibig sabihin nito mula sa pananaw ng ibang tao? Ano ang maiisip ng taong iba sa iyo ang inaasahan, karanasan, at paniniwala? Connections. May katulad ba itong pangyayari sa kasaysayan? Ano ang maaaring kahinatnan nito? Conjecture. Ano kaya kung iba ang nangyari? At relevance. Bakit ito mahalaga? Kanino ito mahalaga? Ang mga tanong na ito ay magagamit sa pagsanay sa kabataan na pag-isipan ang mga impormasyon na kinakaharap nila araw-araw. Students should be active participants in the construction of knowledge, not just passive recipients of information. This does not mean we never instruct or tell them the things they need to learn, but that we maximize the students' involvement in creating the knowledge they are meant to learn. To tell fact from fiction, all information must be open to debate and discussion. In this age of disinformation, it is important that teachers stand in the way of lies, fake news, and historical distortion. It is the duty of teachers to not only teach facts and truth, but to equip our students with the ability to tell facts from falsehood, and to have the conviction to defend the truth when it is under attack. Teachers are not obliged to act neutral towards lies. It is our duty to refute all falsehoods, no matter the source, and to champion reliable sources such as scientists, doctors, historians, researchers, journalists, and other experts of their fields. 3. Education on important social and political issues. There is a notion in this country that teachers should remain apolitical and neutral about social and political issues. But the truth is not neutral. The truth takes sides. And so must teachers take the side of the truth at all times. Sa social media at sa balita, maraming issue ang nalalantad sa mga kabataan araw-araw. Ang ilan dito ay direktang nakakaapekto sa buhay ng ating mga estudyante. Ang iba ay nakakaapekto sa kinabukasan ng kabataan. Kung ang guro ay mananahimik lang tungkol sa mga issue na ito, tinuturo niya sa kanyang mga estudyante na balewalain ang mga mahalagang issue sa lipunan. Hindi ako naniniwala na dapat itago sa kabataan ang mabibigat na katotohanan ng lipunan. Bagkus, dapat silang turuan kahit sa murang edad para hindi sila lumaking ignorante at walang pakialam sa mga nangyayari sa kanilang paligid. Let us teach young people to engage in meaningful discussions about meaningful issues. It is contrived at best and irresponsible at worst to act in our classrooms as if nothing is happening in the real world. So, let's talk about the big things. Talk about death penalty. Talk about extrajudicial killings. Talk about Marcos and martial law. Talk about Duterte and his drug war. Talk about tyranny and fascism. Talk about checks and balances. Talk about human rights. Talk about rape culture. Talk about poverty and privilege. Talk about journalism. Talk about climate justice. Talk about mental health, and so on. Let the classroom be a safe space where difficult topics can be discussed honestly, where different viewpoints can be heard and respectfully scrutinized, where students can share their ideas without fear of judgment, but where the truth is valued above all. Just listen to this teacher talk about discussing racism with his white and black students.
That the space I inhabit at any moment is not neutral. Rather, I'm aware of a complex and conflicting array of student needs that I strive to recognize and respect. In a moment when official structures in our society condone the pointless death of an African American youth, no one should be denied their grief or rage, and there's a strong need to validate it. I look for openings to acknowledge sorrow and fear that people felt, but maintained awareness of my goal of pushing students towards complex and critically nuanced views of society, sometimes asking people to explain ideas more fully or to avoid generalizations. Another consideration as I attempted to create space and when necessary steer the discussion is that it would have been foolish for me to ignore the fact that many of my students of color were impacted more intimately than others in the room by this event. They're required to live their lives with the knowledge that their identities mean facing risk in our society. This moment reminded many that there's rarely accountability for racist acts by government agents. This is information some of my white students had been able to ignore, but needed to be able to hear and understand. For this reason, I paid particular attention to affirming voices and ideas that are too often marginalized.
A lot of the issues we discuss in my classroom when it comes to citizenship are often quite difficult issues. There's discussion about, how race structures citizenship, sexuality, class, gender, and the discussions often become quite uncomfortable and there's a lot of discomfort in the classroom. And so what I'm really grappling with at the moment is how to teach students, to facilitate these discussions that produce discomfort and that produce tension in the classroom. So I'm really beginning to become very interested in sort of pedagogies that deal or address discomfort in a space. The students are very keen to discuss these tension-filled issues and these uncomfortable issues. And so there's always a lot of discussion, but these are discussions that are not often easy to facilitate. So I find myself often stepping in when the discussions go off the rails. So I'm still really struggling and grappling with that.
It's about making sure all voices are heard. It's about sharing values and also just setting ground rules of how we're going to speak. I think about a class I teach where we have difficult conversations every week for 45 minutes. They sit in a circle and they talk, and I sit on the outside. And what I see over the course of a semester is how powerfully kids are able to then share with each other, to push each other, but in respectful ways. But it really starts with those ground expectations of how we're going to respect everyone. And then also just building a community of like, what are our shared connections? How do we empathize and understand each other, even if we come from different places? Because we always have parts of our experiences that we can empathize with each other on.
Difficult topics lead to difficult conversations, but these conversations are important and necessary to have. Avoiding difficult topics has led to people uncomfortable with discussing the bad side of things, and who believe we should always only focus on the positive while ignoring the negative no matter who is affected. But the good is never an excuse for the bad. Let us not teach young people to consider social and political criticism taboo. Let us teach them to protect the values of democracy and freedom and fight the forces that seek to undermine them. As Paulo Freire said, there is no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. One fatal flaw of our schools is that they so often separate young people from privileged backgrounds from their less privileged peers. It is important for those who come from privileged backgrounds to understand how their privilege tends to insulate them from many social ills that directly impact those who live in poverty. Teachers must guide their students to complex and critically nuanced views of society. Part of this means exposing them to voices they are usually able to ignore but need to hear and understand. This can lead to a concern for the welfare of other people. We want young people to understand the causes and effects of social ills, but we do not want them to feel overwhelmed and helpless, but that there is something that can be done and they can be part of the solution. Young people must be exposed to the uncomfortable truths of our society that leave them dissatisfied and hopefully motivated to change things for the better. 4. Education that empowers citizens to hold the powerful accountable. Sa isang demokrasya, ang kapangyarihan ay nasa taong bayan. Pinipili ng mga mamamayan ang kanilang pangulo at mananatili siya sa kapangyarihan ng takdang panahon o hanggang mawala sa kanya ang suporta ng mga tao. May dalawang tungkulin ang mga mamamayan sa isang demokrasya: ang sumunod sa batas ng bayan at ang magbantay sa mga nasa kapangyarihan. Teaching democratic values includes teaching young people to be vigilant against possible government abuse of power. We should not condition our students for mere compliance and conformity. To be active and effective participants in our democratic practices, they must become critical thinkers, not mindless sheep. Ituro natin ang batas ng bayan at pagsunod dito para sa kaayusan ng buhay ng lahat. Ituro din natin ang taus-pusong pagsuporta sa gobyernong tapat na naglilingkod sa taong bayan. Pero, nararapat din ituro na may hangganan ang pagsuporta. Hindi kailangan tanawin ng may utang na loob ang mabubuting gawain ng pamahalaan na para bang bawat gawin nilang mabuti ay nagbibigay sa kanila ng karapatan na gumawa ng mali. Hindi sinusuklian ng katahimikan ang paglilingkod. May panahon para tumindig at magsalita. Turuan natin ang kabataan na bantayan, punahin at panagutin ang mga nasa kapangyarihan para sa bawat kakulangan at kasobrahan. Turuan natin silang maging mapagbatyag at mapanuri at kung kinakailangan ay pumalag laban sa korupsyon, pang-aabuso at paniniin. Turuan natin silang magsalita pag may nakikita silang mali at tumindig para sa mga mahihina, inaapi at isinasantabi sa lipunan. Although the government's trolls and propagandists have repeatedly demonized activism, we must make young people understand that activism is not rebellion. Activism is not a sign of lack of discipline. Vigilance is not disobedience, just as nationalism is not fanaticism. As citizens of the country, it is the right of the youth to be heard on important issues and to criticize their leaders when they feel they are not doing what's best for them. Let us empower the youth to defend our democracy when it becomes necessary. Remember, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Educator Alfie Kohn wrote that democratic education should mean asking inconvenient questions, organizing for collective action, insisting that people be able to participate in making decisions about matters that affect them, and confronting the systemic roots of problems rather than reflexively blaming individuals for their troubles. Our schools today act as if the only thing that matters is preparing students for the next test, whether it's a quiz, a periodical exam or midterm exam, a high school or college entrance test, licensure exams, job interviews. It is time for our schools to confront the challenges that are facing our democracy and to take responsibility for what is happening to our country. Schools must fulfill their roles in the preservation of our democracy. During the last elections, several schools took a stand against misinformation and historical distortion. Other schools must follow their lead. Teaching democracy to our students will require many difficult conversations, but they will be worth it. Requiring ROTC and military service is not the answer. Conditioning people for what Timothy Snyder calls anticipatory obedience, where citizens are prone to voluntarily conforming to the interests of their leaders and never questioning them, is dangerous to a democracy. Nationalism does not mean blind support and ensuring that everyone thinks in a way that the government approves, or ostracizing, even prosecuting those who demand accountability from the government. Ang tunay na edukasyon ay mapagpalaya, mula sa pang-aapi, pananamantala, panunupil, kahirapan, at kawalan ng hustisya. Ang diwa ng demokrasya ay hindi panatikong pagsunod, kundi ang pagiging mapagmatyag at ang pakikilahok sa mga usapan kung anong magpapabuti sa bayan. Ang dakilang hamon ng demokrasya ay kung paano makipag-ugnayan sa mga taong may iba't ibang karanasan at iba't ibang pananaw. At kung hindi man tayo magkasundo, ay maintindihan natin ang isa't isa at makapag-usap ng may respeto at tunay na pakinggan ang isa't isa na laging nakaugat sa katotohanan. Ang makita sa ibang tao, di lang ang ating pagkakaiba, kundi ang ating pagiging kapwa Pilipino. At ang magsalita para sa isa't isa kahit hindi tayo direktang apektado ng isang problema at makita na ang pagtulong sa ating kapwa ay pagtulong din sa ating sarili.